Thank you so much for that introduction, Peter. And, oh, is that your little device? Scooch it. And for the invitation to be here, I'm delighted. I haven't been in Belfast in probably a decade. I spent many heady weekends in my early 20s. You have no idea, Belfast is secretly the New Orleans of Europe. And so I'm really pleased to be back here today. Since we are in a city which has never lost its appreciation for the ways that political parties twist their facts, I'm going to take us back in time to the time of Ireland's second best euphemism, the emergency. I was actually watching the American news show Meet the Press the morning last year when Kellyanne Conway came on and said that she had alternative facts as to the attendance at Trump's inauguration. My head exploded instantly, like many people's did. I was in the final stages of finishing this book about World War II, alternatively known in the south of Ireland as The Emergency, and I suddenly felt like I had been blasted back in time. And of course, it turns out that we've all kind of been blasted back in time in the past 2 years, but that's a different story. Oops, there we go. In 2018, we've heard the phrase, you don't really have to be able to read that. I'm just trying to make things colorful. We've heard the phrase post-truth tossed around a lot. And certainly what Brexit and Trump, among other contemporary political phenomena, have shown us is that objective facts are less influential than emotional appeals in today's political climate. It's alarming, it's terrifying, but it's absolutely not new. So because all of us humanists are always trying to be relevant, I thought I'd talk about how the use of this idea of alternative facts in the emergency, particularly the shaping of the wartime Irish state by De Valera's government, gave rise to a body of what we might call alternative fictions. That is, late modernist writing that used formal techniques of radical disruption and reinvention, learned from both the Gaelic revival and the high modernist movement. And because life is short and I like to read funny things out loud, I'm going to focus on Flann O'Brien's 1939 novel, The Third Policeman, to demonstrate this. If you know it, it's about a bicycle. So I should note that, since I'm in Belfast, I should note that when I say Ireland in this talk, I mean the country that in 1937 named itself simply Ireland. From 1922 to 1937, the Irish Free State. In the 1937 Constitution, it becomes ERA/Ireland. And it is that 1937 Constitution that I want to begin with right now. So, as the Taoiseach Eamon de Valera had good reasons to keep Ireland neutral during the Second World War, it was on the one hand poor and virtually defenseless, on the other playing defense against internal groups like the IRA, which had already declared war on England, and were ready to reignite the civil war from the previous decade should Ireland join the Allied forces. But one problem de Valera faced was how to declare neutrality, and how to govern a small country when the world around it was absolutely at war. The First Amendment to the 1937 Constitution of Ireland enabled the government to enact what was effectively wartime legislation without declaring war. To do this, the First Amendment redefined the Constitution's phrase, "in time of war," to include the present conflict. It reads, "In this subsection, time of war includes the time when there is taking place an armed conflict in which the state is not a participant, but in respect of which each of the houses of the Oireachtas shall have resolved that, arising out of such armed conflict, a national emergency exists affecting the vital interests of the state." The phrase "in time of war" no longer just meant "in time of war." In effect, under this amendment, being at peace could legally mean the same thing as being at war. It was, you could say, an alternative fact. The phrase "national emergency" legalized the government's ability to function under a state of emergency, enshrining de Valera's euphemism into the Constitution, while also guaranteeing that though emergency might sound like a benign euphemism for war, it was in fact the legal name for an extrajuridical state of exception. The rewriting of the constitutional definition of war enabled the Oireachtas to pass the Emergency Powers Act, which governed Ireland by decree until after the war ended. and which, when we sort of are turning our minds towards the study of literature, crucially, enabled existing censorship laws like the Censorship of Publications Act to accommodate wartime censorship as well, thereby empowering a censorship board that made decisions about literary texts under the banner of wartime security. The newly empowered censorship board crucially conflated cultural and political censorship under the banner of the safety of the Irish people. This had obvious ramifications for literary production, but it also had a lasting impact on the way the state was able to legislate cultural nationalism. Ireland's wartime neutrality was practice as much as policy. Nowhere is it actually written into the law. It remains a practice rather than a policy. Lots of people actually have very murky understandings of that. One of the major aims of neutrality was not to be neutral, but to appear neutral. And this is still very much the case today. So an example of this is the Dunny corridor, which is marked here on this US Air Force map, which is probably the most famous example of Ireland's friendly neutrality towards the Allies, which basically was 7 miles of Irish land that Allied planes could skim over to land in Northern Irish territory that was just discreetly overlooked. It enabled the Allied planes to get out into the North Atlantic farther to attack U-boats that they wouldn't have been able to reach otherwise. But it wasn't until this decade that the Irish government even admitted its existence, and now there are some little plaques up around. It wasn't until this decade that soldiers who deserted the Irish Defense Forces to serve the Allies received a mostly posthumous pardon. Like alternative facts, post-truth, appearance trumped reality. And of course, in many ways, appearance was reality in wartime, when seeming to lean one way or the other could land you covered in bombs. So, appearances were important, and one thing I actually just recently discovered, which while I was looking for images for this talk, and I'm fascinated, is that 1939 saw the creation of the emergency, and in the very same month, the creation of the first government-sanctioned Irish tourist board, so the predecessor, the board called QUB. It played a major role in shaping Ireland's appearance, both to Irish people and to foreigners. So I've pulled a bunch of images from tourist brochures at that time, from the 30s, and also from the Irish Travel magazine, the official organ of the Irish Tourist Association, which becomes the Irish Tourist Board. So contemporary issues of the Irish Tourist Association's magazine, Irish Travel, veer between shots of Irish beauty spots and the glamorization of Irish peasant life. Its pages encapsulate the Fianna Fáil style view of the Irishman as happy, Gaelic, and free. Nowhere is this better displayed, so this one is bringing home the hay, telling us that it gives the children, incidentally, a grand jaunt along the way. This is September 1939, so the month that neutrality/war was declared. But nowhere is this better displayed than in De Valera's speeches and statements for radio, which were specifically aimed at both domestic and international audiences. Okay, so De Valera's famous St. Patrick's Day radio broadcast of 1943 is probably the most ironically beloved piece of political discourse from the era. It opens with an often elided sentence that conflates the ideas of physical and spiritual safety. And this is a long paragraph. I'm going to put it all up there. I'll read it. It begins, acutely conscious, though we all are, of the misery and desolation in which the greater part of the world is plunged. Let us turn aside for a moment to that ideal Ireland that we would have. So for De Valera, nationalist retrenchment is the antidote to a world in misery. And here is his vision. The ideal Ireland that we would have, the Ireland that we dreamed of, would be the home of a people who valued material wealth only as a basis for right living. A people who, satisfied with frugal comfort, devoted their leisure to the things of the spirit. A land whose countryside would be bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages would be joyous with the sounds of industry, with the romping of sturdy children, the contest of athletic youths, and the laughter of happy maidens, whose firesides would be forums for the wisdom of serene old age. The home, in short, of a people living the life that God desires that men should live. The Irish press misquoted the happy maidens as comely maidens, and the address has gone down in history misremembered as the comely maidens dancing at the crossroads speech. I think this revision in itself speaks volumes about how De Valera's policies were viewed by Irish people, especially those critical of his cultural project, one in which poverty is a spiritual asset, the citizenry are doggedly connected to the land, and neutrality, cultural and political, could be mobilized as part of a higher aim, living the will of God. One doesn't have to look very far to find comely maidens in the tourist advertising from the period. And a lot of these really great shots are from Great Southern Railways. So these came from the National Library of Ireland, which has an exhibit online with tourist posters from the 30s, which is a very cool exhibit. So by the emergency, these comely maidens were becoming government policy. But the gap between fact and alternative facts that appears clearly when one considers the Irish government's attitude towards representations of that ideal Ireland in print. Some of the more celebrated censorship cases of the period demonstrate this. Cases where writing putatively about real peasants came up against the censor's wrath. So like Patrick Kavanagh's The Great Hunger, then sort of middle-class things like Sean O'Fallon's Midsummer Night Madness and Bird Alone, Frank O'Connor's English translation of The Midnight Court. I'm going to butcher the Irish, Kurt and Mihan Iha. How did I do? Not very well, sorry. I'm American. I can read it, but I can't speak it. Eric Cross's The Tailor and Anstey, which was a compendium of fireside chat from an Irish-speaking tailor in County Kerry. It was famously banned for profane language, which now, of course, it can't be. Things have changed in 2018, this week. So, okay, where am I? Sorry. Looking at the records, it becomes clear that the administration used the censorship provisions of the Emergency Powers Act to legislate cultural nationalism in print. And what stands out most clearly from the records of the Oireachtas is that supporters of censorship in almost all cases conflated political and cultural censorship. So Senator Martin O'Dwyer's 1942 speech in support of the banning of the Tailor and Anstey is a good example. He says, "Today the government have to meet another danger, that of foreign invasion. There is an even greater danger confronting us, the danger of this tide of immorality which is pervading the whole world. It is the duty of the government to defend the virtue of the Irish people against the immoral literature that threatens to overwhelm it. If these modern ideas, as I call them, get a hold, the virtue of the whole Irish race would be in danger." So the Irish race has now voted virtue out of the Constitution, so we have nothing to worry about. But while imaginary peasants were praised in the 1940s by Taoiseach and TDs alike, their values catered to in campaigns contrasted with the vice-ridden city dwellers. When translated into English, indeed, when made audible to the majority of the Irish reading public, their fires were snuffed out, their PQ and Abbey Theatre parlance, a little too peasant and not enough quality. In short, De Valera's dream of a conservative Gaelic Ireland was just that, an alternative fiction. Confronted with the real thing, at least in print, the censorship board quickly condemned it as blasphemy. Or, as Senator William McGuinness put it in that same debate, "It is propaganda to show the English-speaking world what manner of man the Irish peasant is, who is the citizen of era. It is propaganda, naked and unashamed." So he believed that these sort of realistic portrayals of Irish peasants were actually English propaganda to try to make the Irish look bad. Of course, Senator McGuinness was right. The Irish peasant was a matter of propaganda, and his fear that bawdy-cursing peasants like the tailor presented by Eric Cross was English propaganda only underscores how enthralled he was to his own party's alternative fictions. The second half of the Ireland That We Dreamed Of speech is devoted to the 50th anniversary of the Gaelic League. In it, De Valera revisits the ghost of Pearse to conflate politics and poetry in his own peculiar ashling. He says, It was the idea of an Ireland, happy, vigorous, spiritual, that fired the imagination of our poets, that made successive generations of patriotic men give their lives to win religious and political liberty. To achieve this dream vision, the Taoiseach inveighs his people to bring the Irish language into daily use, claiming, the more we preserve and develop our individuality and our characteristics as a distinct nation, the more secure will be our freedom and the more valuable our contribution to humanity after this war is over. If the Gaelic League aimed for cultural sovereignty as a foothold towards political independence, 50 years later, the head of that independent government used the threat that war represented to Irish sovereignty as prime justification for promoting cultural nationalism. More comely maidens. Many writers took aim at the government's limited ideas of who Ireland belonged to and what it stood for. Sean O'Fallon inveighed monthly in his editorials in The Bell against what he saw as the tired old cliches of nationalism. He promoted a new Irish realism and called for contributors that would give a clear picture of a multifaceted, emergent Ireland. All our symbols, he claimed, need to be created afresh. The revival was over, and new literature needed to emerge. Ronan MacDonald has summarized the literary response to the Irish revival as an Oedipal opposition. He writes, quote, those who came after sought to demythologize it, to contrast its investment in legend and folklore to the mess and murk of lived experience. There are those who reject the revival in the name of a harder social realism and those who reject it for avant-garde modernism. And Flann O'Brien, who I'm about to turn to, is generally classed in the latter camp, though his travestying of rural poverty plays the role of social realism too. And part of this talk is I'm going to argue a little bit that he's more realistic than we think he is. But he also couldn't have written without the revival. And as MacDonald argues, quote, far from the opposite of modernism, the revival is now typically regarded as an incubatory moment of it, its anti-modern ideology of a piece with the modernist disdain for bourgeois values and prefabricated realist forms. The revivalists, after all, were subversive at the core, aiming to upend tired caricatures of the Celt in favor of an authentic national literature. To remember the Gaelic revival as nothing but tired cliches in the twilight is to forget the actual rioting that it caused and the forces of change that it galvanized. But as rebels inherit the reins of government, it is their ideology, not their subversive spirit, which becomes law. In a nation whose president was the president of the Gaelic League, revival ideology, not revivalist disruption, became institutionalized. And as Free State and era governments ossified the revival, its subversion was subsumed into a sort of camp. Under the shrinking of the literary audience and the pressures of nationalist censorship, the emergency became a moment of aesthetic crisis for Irish writers. Late modernists writing during the emergency returned in spirit to the revival's disruptive energies, while simultaneously eschewing its aesthetics as the bourgeois clothing of official republicanism. The result is a body of texts whose language, even when putatively realistic, like Kavanagh's or Fallon's, incubates a strange waywardness of a late modernism. Irish late modernists responded to the emergency's pressures on language with the urgency of a crisis that was simultaneously political and aesthetic. So here, we make a Dublin diversion. So I want to pause here and turn our thoughts to Flann O'Brien and show how The Third Policeman, a novel that has been interpreted in wildly different ways, reveals, when read as a novel of the emergency, the special way in which an Irish late modernism emerges and channels the energies of its moment to produce a satirical vision of De Valera's Ireland that is both politically and linguistically subversive. It's an alternative fiction that alters the language of the revival into the language of late modernism. The Third Policeman begins with an admission. Not everybody knows how I killed old Philip Mathers. But the crucial moment of the book hinges on a lie. The narrator's accomplice, Divney, instructs him to lie to anyone who sees him going into old Mathers' house, where Divney has hidden the black cash box they killed the man for. The narrator replies, I don't even know my own name. "This was a very remarkable thing for me to say," he then remarks, "because the next time I was asked my name, I could not answer. I did not know." And so the nameless narrator's adventures begin through a strange other world known only as the parish, and they hinge on a series of alternative facts. He invents a lie about a stolen watch so that he can ask the local guards about the cash box he wants to find. The police, in turn, spend their days hiding parishioners' bicycles and lying about it. And when called upon to find a murderer at large, they seize upon the convenience of the narrator's presence in the barracks and determine to hang him for the crime. While this is an alternative fact, he hasn't apparently murdered anyone in this part of the story. It's also true, because in the frame story, he is a murderer. So he's innocent in the world of the parish, but guilty in the sort of outer frame story of the novel. I don't know, how many of you, maybe show of hands, how many of you know the book? Okay, so hopefully the rest of you will be able to follow along and will want to read it afterwards. It's really funny and really, really strange. In a letter to William Saroyan, which is nearly always printed with the text and a publisher's note, but not actually part of the novel, but is very often quoted, the author suggests that the parish is in fact a hell, that the narrator, quote, has been dead throughout the book, and that all the queer, ghastly things which have been happening to him are happening in a sort of hell which he has earned for the killing. But the thing about this hell is that it is, in its realistic moments, almost indistinguishable from rural Ireland in the 1930s. The Third Policeman was written mostly in 1939 and completed by February 1940, while O'Brien, under his real name, Brian O'Nolan, continued his work in the Irish Civil Service in Dublin. In mid-1940, as his new novel, because he had published At Swim Two Birds in 1939, which almost nobody read, and he blamed Hitler for it having bad sales. He began channeling his creativity into the pen of his other alter ego, Miles Nagopaline, and his Irish Times column, The Cruiskeen Lawn. More on this later if I have time, which is a more straightforward, though no less playful indicator of O'Brien's opinions on politics and print culture during the emergency. You don't have to be able to read that. I just like pictures. Keeps you awake. In Public Works, it's a 2010 monograph, Michael Rubenstein carefully contextualizes The Third Policeman, saying that the novel's bizarre setting is, quote, not a Catholic hell, but a national hell. The hell of The Third Policeman is the landscape of the national imaginary incorporated onto the state's modern grid, resulting in sublime horror and comic farce. Close quote. O'Brien's novel's faithfulness to the bureaucratic mores of late 1930s Ireland is one of many historical traces that persist amidst the dystopian landscape of the novel. And because the novel is like a really early dystopian novel, a lot of critics did not read it as any sort of realistic portrayal of its time period. It also was hindered by the fact that it wasn't published until after he died in 1966. So it comes out almost 30 years after it was written. And by then, people are wanting to read the novel as a sort of like wild postmodern avant-garde thing, without thinking about what kind of commentary it was making on the moment in which it was written. So when the sergeant inquires of the narrator, would it surprise you to be told that the atomic theory is at work in this parish? He goes on to explain, the lock, stock, and barrel of it all is the county council. So the novel is in fact deeply concerned with sort of the bureaucracy of local government. It's also deeply concerned with contemporary science. So the novel has this very strange relationship with atomic energy and bombs. It's one of the most curious of its historical features. The world of the novel exploits new science, particularly the notion of the atom and the atomic half-life, by interpreting it over literally to the point of total ridiculousness. So Sergeant Pluck, one of the three policemen, explains to the narrator, everything is composed of small particles of itself, and they are flying around in concentric circles and arcs and segments and innumerable other geometrical figures too numerous to mention collectively, never standing still or resting, but spinning away and darting hither and thither and back again all the time on the go. These diminutive gentlemen are called atoms. And these atoms, the sergeant goes on to explain, have the potential to exchange places with each other, as between an anvil and a hammer. And he says, the gross and net result of it is that people who have spent most of their natural lives riding iron bicycles over the rocky roadsteads of this parish get their personalities mixed up with the personalities of their bicycle as a result of the interchanging of the atoms of each of them. And you would be surprised at the number of people in these parts who are nearly half people and half bicycle. And this is why the policemen spend their days hiding people's bicycles, because they don't want people to become full bicycles, so they just hide bicycle parts. And then every time someone comes into the police station, they say, "Is it about a bicycle?" And they can't imagine any other question that's about anything else. In addition to governing the scientific properties of the parish in the novel, according to R.W. Maslin, the presence of atomic theory in the book links the local crises of the newly fledged Irish nation with the deepening global crisis at the end of the 1930s. And the novel is constantly playing on ideas like this. There are about 10 different things in the novel that look like a bomb. The narrator at one point asks for a small weapon suitable for the pocket, which will exterminate any man or any million men who try at any time to take my life. And he's offered a tool that he's told will change any man or men into gray powder at once if you point it and press the knob. So you can see the sort of like terror of bombardment and nuclear weapons kind of built into the comedy of this novel. So here's another Irish travel picture from 1939. Other traces of emergency life abound in the novel, and ways that are prophetic of Irish conditions, if not indicative of them. For instance, Ireland suffered a tremendous fuel shortage throughout the war, rendering a recently motorized country dependent on horse carts and bicycles. They also tried to do things like run trains on turf, which didn't work very well. If the parish of the Third Policeman is rural Ireland in a vacuum, populated, like the Great Hunger, almost entirely by aging bachelor farmers, its bicycle-bound, local police-enforced isolation is not terribly different from Ireland during World War II. Policeman McCruskeen's insistence on the usefulness of his patent inventions, like the box full of noise that he and the sergeant planned to convert, he says, into light and heat for our official life in the dark winter, is a spin-off of De Valera's Emergency Scientific Research Bureau, which was also one of Miles Nagopalin's favorite targets in the Kruskeen lawn. The quest for self-sufficiency in the barracks and its utilities recalls the Shannon hydroelectric scheme, which you can see here is being touted as like a tourist place to go in Limerick, which had been founded the previous decade with the aim of providing nationwide electricity. But the effect of emergency shortages and rationing was that rural Ireland became darker than ever. Michael Rubenstein notes the failure of such public works when he reads the uncanny landscape of O'Brien's parish as, quote, an allegory of the nation-state, which accuses the nation-state of what, according to the novel, would be its epic failure. Rubenstein is interested specifically in his book in the utilities, but as a critique of the young state. But actually, I think the landscape itself becomes a critique of the state, and this is one of the things that I think is so interesting about the novel. So the novel's landscape is really peculiar. So I know this turned out kind of hard to read. I'm not very good at making PowerPoints. I'm going to read it to you, though. So in the novel, you find, he says, my surroundings had a strangeness of a peculiar kind, entirely separate from the mere strangeness of a country where one has never been before. Everything seemed almost too pleasant, too perfect, too finely made. Each thing the eye could see was unmistakable and unambiguous, incapable of merging with any other thing or being confused with it. The color of the bogs was beautiful, and the greenness of the green fields supernal. Trees were arranged here and there with far from usual consideration for the fastidious eye. In the landscape, we're told that the tall hills and the fine views of bogland had been arranged by wise hands for the pleasing picture they made when looked at from the road. This suggests a landscape that is somehow altered to taste by a higher power. Such wise hands appear to be those of the government, linking state power to aesthetic autonomy, phenophile ideology to the arrangement of the landscape, which here is unsettling, too pleasant, too perfect, too finely made. If the landscape is reminiscent of the perfect, self-sufficient Ireland that De Valera dreamed of, for the narrator of The Third Policeman, the dream becomes a nightmare. following the narrator through the parish, a reader might be inclined to disbelieve that this novel was written before that 1943 speech, in which De Valera imagines the land whose countryside is bright with cozy homesteads, whose fields and villages are joyous with the sounds of industry. For here in the parish, according to the narrator, the world rang in my ear like a great workshop. Sublime feats of mechanics and chemistry were evident on every side. The earth was agog with invisible industry. Men who were notable for the whiteness of their shirts worked diminutively in the distant bog, toiling in the brown turf and heather. At another point, the narrator notes, oops, that's not there. Hold on. Brown bogs and black bogs were arranged neatly on either side of the road. He says, hold on, okay. Brown bogs and black bogs were arranged neatly on each side of the road. Far away near the sky, tiny people were stooped at their turf work. He goes on, sounds came from them to the sergeant and myself, delivered to our ears without charge by the west wind, sounds of laughing and whistling, and bits of verses from the old bog songs. If these neatly arranged fields are joyous with the sound of industry, they come at a price to the narrator's mind, for they unnerve him entirely. At this idyllic vista, he says, I would not mind being working this minute on a steamer in the middle of the sea, coiling ropes and doing the hard manual work. I would like to be far away from here. So this place is so perfect, it's actually making him crazy. Like many of the descriptive passages in the novel, this one relies on a curious use of the pathetic fallacy to attribute industrial qualities to the natural world. So the bogs are arranged, the wind delivers without charge. In this one, we have, near a house stood attended by 3 trees and surrounded by the happiness of a coterie of fowls, all of them picking and rooting and disputating loudly in the unrelenting manufacture of their eggs. The house was quiet in itself, but a canopy of lazy smoke had been erected over the chimney to indicate that people were within, engaged on tasks. So the hens are manufacturing eggs. The smoke has been erected over the chimney, so you know people are working inside. The landscape itself appears to be a facsimile of statist ideology, deliberately overwrought and mechanically productive rather than an organic creation. Recalling the tiny people standing near the sky, it appears to be some sort of visual image, like a magazine shot or ad copy, rather than a description of an actual landscape. Early in the book, the narrator says that the police barracks looked as if it were painted like an advertisement on a board on the roadside, and indeed very poorly painted. It looked completely false and unconvincing. So it's not really Ireland, it's an advertisement of Ireland. And in general, as the narrator explains, it was a queer country we were in. There was a number of blue mountains at what you might call a respectful distance, with the glint of white water coming down the shoulders of 1 or 2 of them, and they kept hemming us in and meddling oppressively with our minds. Overwrought with the De Valeran aesthetic, the parish is inhumanly perfect. Even the landscape is able to meddle with and oppress the inhabitants' minds. Likewise, the form of this novel, so you're not distracted. The form of this novel itself is designed to meddle with the reader's mind. The problem of accessing any sort of actual truth in the novel is compounded by the problem of how to articulate it, and the novel is overloaded with textual difficulty. Notably, O'Brien's extensive use of metafictional devices, such as self-conscious narration and footnotes, which tend to overwhelm the text precisely at its moments of highest suspense, making it nearly impossible to follow the narrative for all the intrusions. So like at actually moments in the text when something is finally exciting happening, you'll get half the page will be covered in footnotes about something completely different. So I wish I had a copy of it to show you, because it makes it really hard to read. You don't know where to put your eyes. The validity of the text is also questionable from the beginning. It opens with a set of epigraphs. One is from Shakespeare, and one is from the fictional philosopher of science, de Selby, who appears in the novel. So even the epigraph starts to toy with the notions of what is real and what is fake. The narration of the novel is skeptical. The narrator, after all, has been dead the whole time and narrates from beyond the grave. The ending of the novel makes clear that the narrator is, in fact, forever narrating the third policeman. The last few pages, the narrator repeats the beginning of the novel, almost verbatim, in perfect ignorance that this has all happened before. So basically, as a reader, you have to just keep reading the novel, kind of like Finnegan's Wake, for the rest of your life. Don't, though. Any notion of narrative authority is thoroughly undermined at the novel's end, throwing everything the reader knows into doubt. Because the ending of the third policeman rewrites the beginning, another alternative fiction, it rewrites the narrator's relationship to the narrative and the readers as well. So, in a world where the narrator finds that it is, quote, difficult to convey it with known words what my eyes were looking at, where it's increasingly impossible for him to believe what he sees, the reader is at a further remove from any stable truth. The act of reading itself becomes an allegory of skepticism. Throughout the novel, the narrator chronicles his obsession with the work of the scientist de Selby. In a series of comments and heavy annotations, taken together, these form a narrative of their own, a hilarious chronicle of the dangers of misprision. De Selby's work represents always a crazed conviction that the mainstream conceptions of reality are not as they seem, that the earth, for example, is shaped like a sausage, that night is an unsanitary accretion of black air. So you have all these stories about de Selby's followers who end up dying in the quest to sort of create the worlds that he has described in his books. And if de Selby's misreadings lead to the deaths of his followers, it is no surprise. It's also a really great parody of academia, with people sort of chasing each other to Berlin and shooting each other and trying to steal it and impersonating themselves. It's bizarre. If De Selbyana is a parade of misreadings, a chronicle of forgeries and false names, it's capped by the infamous De Selby Codex. Quote, the signal distinction of the manuscript is that not one word of the writing is legible. Attempts made by different commentators to decipher certain passages which look less formidable than others have been characterized by fantastic divergencies, which really the same thing can be said of the novel itself. I had a bunch of examples, but I'm going to skip them. We'll just put a gallows up there instead. What is the world going to do when they look at my search history and I was searching for photos of gallows? Don't want to know. The Russians know. I could go on really all day, and I won't, listing the misreadings that motivate the text, but the novel is a parade of them. The sort of, everything that happens is in fact the result of misunderstanding or misinterpreting something that happened before. Similarly, at the end, the narrator misinterprets the fact that he's dead, and so the novel just goes on forever. But I want to conclude by looking at the alternative facts presented by the guardians of government bureaucracy in this novel, the police. So when the narrator realizes, upon being asked by the dead old Mathers that he does not know his own name, he responds, I can always get a name. Doyle or Spaldman is a good name, and so is O'Sweeney and Hardiman and O'Gara. I can take my choice. I am not tied down for life to one word, like most people. But in his dealings with the police, the narrator does, in fact, need a name. As the policemen present possible names, including nicknames, the narrator realizes the necessity of being tied down to one word, for finding the right name. For if you don't have a name, as one of the policemen says, if you have no name, this is weird. Oh, there we go. If you have no name, you possess nothing, and you do not exist. And even your trousers are not on you, although they look as if they were, from where I'm sitting. So on and on goes this sort of suggestion and rejection of names. Quote, an amazing piece of denial and denunciation, an astonishing parade of nullity. Unable to provide an alternative fact as to his own name, having sworn it away when he promised to lie about the murder, the narrator is sentenced to hang for a murder he did not commit. The narrator initially finds himself arrested as a sacrifice to rural bureaucracy. The police inspector has shown up, suddenly announced that someone has been murdered, demands that a criminal be brought in. Having spent the afternoon hiding and retrieving local bicycles, the sergeant cannot be exposed as a failure. So he casually announces that the murderer has already been apprehended. The narrator is conveniently at hand. It is the way we work in this part of the country, explains the sergeant. Soon, the narrator attempts to bargain his namelessness into neutrality, contending that if he has no name and no standing under the law, he cannot be hanged. Sergeant Pluck responds, "It is true that you cannot commit a crime and that the right hand of the law cannot lay its finger on you, irrespective of the degree of your criminality. Anything you do is a lie, and nothing that happens to you is true." He goes on and says, "For that reason alone," said the sergeant, "we can take you and hang the life out of you, and you are not hanged at all, and there is no entry to be made in the death papers. The particular death you die is not even a death, which is an inferior phenomenon at best. Only an insanitary abstraction in the backyard, a piece of negative nullity neutralized and rendered void by asphyxiation and the fracture of the spinal string. If it is not a lie to say that you've been given the final hammer behind the barrack, equally it is true to say that nothing has happened to you." So tied into this legal tangle is not just a commentary on the linguistics of naming, but also an allusion to the Irish wartime policy of negative nullity neutralized. Ireland's effort at neutrality, O'Brien suggests, is an effort to be blameless with regard to the atrocities of the war, and to censor it into unspeakability and avoid complicity. But, as you can see, it doesn't really make any sense when you think about it. It's also a condemnation of the machinations of the local parish. The policemen in this parish have kept meticulous records of bicycles, but are happy to arrange a hasty hanging to satisfy their superior. Their concerns to the narrator are amazingly local and petty. Once in possession of a formidable substance called omnium, which is described as the essential inherent interior essence, which is hidden inside the root of the kernel of everything. The titular third policeman chooses to use this omnium for mundane purposes. Wallpapering, that's not mundane. Wallpapering is hard. Removing muck from his leggings, boiling an egg. The narrator is aghast. He says, oops, backward, too fancy. How do I get backwards? Okay. That if he had a box of omnium, he could do anything, see anything, and know anything with no limit to my powers, save that of my own imagination. I could destroy, alter, and improve the universe at will. And so what would he do? He says, fruits and crops surpassing anything ever known would flower on my farm. An earth made inconceivably fertile by unparalleled artificial manures. I would present every poor laborer in the world with a bicycle made of gold, each machine with a saddle made of something as yet uninvented but softer than the softest softness. And I would arrange that a warm gale would blow behind every man on every journey, even when two were going in opposite directions on the same road. My sow would farrow twice daily, and a man would call immediately offering 10 million pounds for each of the piglings, only to be outbid by a second man arriving and offering 20 million. The barrels and bottles in my public house would still be full and inexhaustible, no matter how much was drawn out of them. The fact is that much of this list simply mirrors the concerns of the small farmholder, with just a few extravagances. Every Tuesday, I would make myself invisible. In conjuring the alternative fiction that might be his life, the narrator finds himself still enthralled by a revivalist ideology that imagines perfect happiness for the rural farmer. His imaginings are steeped in Irishisms, that the roads will rise to meet the happy laborers, that wild prosperity awaits the small farmer, that the pub's barrels would be bottomless. This is quite specifically an imagined Ireland. After all, in his alternative fiction, the narrator would even, quote, improve the weather to a standard day of sunny peace, with a gentle rain at night washing the world to make it fresher and more enchanting to the eye. If he can alter the universe at will, like a national creator god, the one he imagines is unambiguously rural and Irish. It sounds a lot like the same one that De Valera imagines. But in a story where the narrator himself can't tell the difference between truth and fiction, he keeps forgetting, for example, that he never actually had the American gold watch he reported stolen. It's the heady imagining of this utopia of alternate facts that damns him. As he reaches for the box of omnium, for the second time, or the millionth time, the black box explodes, killing his dream with him. This ideal Ireland is not a dream, but a nightmare that the narrator will have to repeat ad infinitum. Now, I have a bit from the crew scheme line, but I'll skip it, and if you guys are interested, we can talk about it later. There's our boy Flan. So, the sort of, it's interesting, the kind of afterlife of Flann O'Brien, because he's had his 100th anniversary and he's kind of having a moment. Most interestingly to me, the 2005 play Improbable Frequency, which has toured globally actually, casts him as a character and borrows a lot of sort of O'Brien-esque things for the plot. It's a sort of science fiction romantic spy comedy with singing set during the emergency. It's really weird and funny. And the continued popularity of the Kruskeen Lawn and Miles Nagopoulian's columns attest to O'Brien's centrality in Dublin letters during this period. But O'Brien was not a lone genius in his tower. He wasn't even a single person. He was sort of 3 different people, or 4 or 5, depending on how many of his different pen names you read. Nor was he, as he liked to claim, he could become the great Irish artist living in exile. He was a minor civil servant, living through the emergency on a state salary while dodging the censor whose employer he shared. He was, as he liked to call them in his column, one of the plain people of Ireland, or at least their wiser, wiseacre mouthpiece. And as unique and strange as his writings may appear, they actually share much with the fabric of other emergency-era writing in their attempt to break through the twinned aesthetic autonomy of revivalism and high modernism, and the political autonomy of the censor's sort of neutral language edicts, to something inevitably stranger and wilder, to an alternative fiction that can counter the government's alternative facts. Those who wrote in the emergency wrote in its own language, taking rhetorical evasiveness as their aesthetic and mining it for meaning. Emergency writing constitutes both an ethical and a formal response to the political practices of what was an emerging Ireland.